Hi, I'm Chris Wolfe of the American Public Philosophy Institute, and I have the pleasure today to interview W. Bradford Wilcox of the University of Virginia, where he teaches sociology, and he's also director of the National Marriage Project. Welcome to Dallas, Brad. It's really good to have you here.
Chris, it's great to be here at the University of Dallas.
Okay, now I want to start off a little bit with some of your intellectual autobiography. Where'd you go to school, and kind of how did you get interested in the questions you got interested in there?
I went to the University of Virginia, and I had in my first year a professor, Michael Eshelman, who was a very challenging English professor and presented books to us in that first year class, you know, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Stendhal, that raised kind of fundamental questions about the human condition, questions that I hadn't really thought about that much. And questions about kind of the origin of the good, for instance. And it was really in that class that I got thinking a lot more seriously about the nature of good and evil, human condition, and in ways that kind of began to sort of push me in a more culturally conservative direction. He also kind of put me onto first things at that point. Mm. So that was sort of the genesis of and I kind of came into the University of Virginia as a kind of a standard issue, mainline Protestant progressive, and Michael Eshelman's class and his sort of intellectual persona were such that he kind of challenged me on a number of different levels and began, forcing me to think about some different ways of, looking at culture, politics, and the academic life more generally.
So eventually, apparently, you got around to studying sociology. How did that happen?
Yeah, I didn't take a sociology class until I think my third or fourth year at the University of Virginia. I took a class on criminology and then a class on modernity with James Hunter in my fourth year. And that class was really the class that led me to think a lot more about sociology as a potential profession. I majored in government at UVA, was at the government honors program, and wrote a thesis on the rise of urban violence in the 70s and 80s. And I guess, but even that thesis was in some ways more sociological than it was political, and so that class though with James Hunter was. We read his book Culture Wars, which had just come out. We read some Richard Rorty. We read Alistair MacIntyre. Just some really important texts on the sort of the nature and origins of morality in contemporary life, the cultural divisions that we have now in the U.S. around these questions, and a lot of thinking about kind of the nature of contemporary moral and political pluralism. So that was a fascinating class, and that was the class that got me thinking about a potential doctorate in sociology.
Right, so you're at the end of your career, you're trying to decide what to do. So what were kind of the options? That was pretty clearly the path for you, or it was kind of a choosing between that and other things?
Well, I worked for 2 years after graduating from UVA for Amitai Tzioni, who was then leading the Communitarian Network in a journal called The Responsive Community. Sure. And basically Tzioni was trying to advance a kind of centrist perspective, one which balanced with rights with responsibilities, a regard for the individual with a regard for the needs of the commonweal or the community. That experience working with him and many of his colleagues, including Marianne Glendon and Bill Galston, was an enjoyable one, but I had the sense that I wanted to go further and to delve deeper, and that led me to to apply for sociology PhDs and eventually go to Princeton.
Uh-huh. So, and how did you find your time at Princeton?
I found my time at Princeton to be pretty congenial. I was definitely coming in with interest in religion and family and culture, and was the most conservative member of my cohort. And I think that experience of being a conservative in a sociology graduate program was challenging at times, I would raise points or questions that were not necessarily ones that people were used to hearing. But it was a good one. And most of the faculty members there were, I think, fair-minded in terms of how they dealt with someone who wasn't, kind of a standard issue sociology graduate student, So, and more particularly, though, I had, I think, very good guidance from Robert Wethnow and from Sarah McClanahan, one on religion and the other on family and stratification, that enabled me to kind of get a foundation both in the sociology of religion and the sociology of family that has served me well since graduating from Princeton. They both were, I think, fair-minded scholars who, in their own ways, I think would tilt in a more progressive direction, but were kind of also open to perspectives that were intellectually that were rooted in a certain kind of rigorous encounter with, or say rigorous foundation in in books or in studies that that were consistent. In other words, what I'm saying is, so for instance, in a graduate seminar with Sarah McClanahan, I was the only conservative on family issues, but I think what Sarah appreciated about my perspective was that I always tried to make my claims with reference to studies that we had been reading or that I'd read outside of class that were, and she was perfectly willing to entertain ones that had some kind of empirical basis to them.
Yeah. So what do you eventually gravitate toward in terms of your dissertation, and how did you choose that topic, and what'd you do?
I wrote a dissertation that turned into a book for the University of Chicago Press that was called Soft Patriarchs, New Men, and looked at the links between sort of religion, marriage, and fatherhood for contemporary men. And I focused on mainline and evangelical Protestant men here in the United States, and compared them to men who had no active religious affiliation. And what I was trying to do in that particular project was to sort of understand how the family revolution, understood as kind of a retreat from marriage, where we're seeing, at that point, more divorce, more single parenthood, and the gender revolution, where we're seeing a shift towards a more egalitarian society, had affected these two religious traditions, and then in turn how these two traditions were impacting the lives of ordinary men who were engaged in their congregational, or in the congregations from those two traditions. And so basically argued that in terms of thinking about sort of the impact of those two traditions on men, that religion was kind of a domesticating force for guys, a force that tended to encourage them to be more engaged husbands and fathers, but particularly for evangelicals was also kind of more broadly kind of a force for kind of a neo-traditionalism. So on the one hand, encouraging guys to be emotionally and practically engaged with their wife and children, in ways you could sort of mark as more progressive, particularly in being more emotionally expressive than men had been prior to the 70s. But also kind of traditional in the sense of holding out, particularly for the evangelicals, to more traditional ideals about gender and marriage is kind of the ideal place for the, the bearing and rearing of kids. So I come down at the end of the book by saying that religions in the United States is largely a kind of a force for a kind of neo-traditional familism. And the question is, sort of going forward, can religion play a role in stemming or reversing, particularly the retreat from marriage that we've been seeing really since the 1950s? So
are you still kind of on the borderline of sociology of religion and sociology of the family at that point? And where did you go from there?
Well, after finishing that book, I moved more in the direction of sociology of the family, although I have a book coming out this year called Soulmates, Religion, Sex, Love, and Marriage Among African Americans and Latinos. And that book, again, addresses the question of how does religion shape the lives of Black and Latino families. So we're kind of shifting from a focus on kind of basically white mainline Protestants and white evangelicals looking at Black and Latino, both Catholics and Protestants in the United States. But by and large, besides this book coming out this year, my focus has been much more on kind of on broader questions related to marriage, cohabitation, fatherhood, and the welfare of kids. And so back in the mid 2000s, got more involved with David Blankenhorn at the Institute for American Values and his work on marriage and fatherhood, and began to write for more popular audiences and engage more popular questions, partly through the work of the Institute for American Values. And I think his book, Fatherless America, was instrumental in terms of pushing me to think more deeply about fatherhood, as well as David Papineau's book on fatherhood as well. And so those two figures, Papineau and Blankenhorn, one of the Institute for American Values, one of the National Marriage Project, were, helping me to think about how I could address and speak to these issues in a more public way.
So what kinds, well, you've mentioned a few of the issues, I guess, but how did you pursue studying some of those issues in ways that you thought would be valuable for scholarship, as also, well, perhaps having a valuable public dimension as well?
Well, I read those books. I read other books on fatherhood and marriage. Read lots of studies, and just began to write for more popular venues. Whether it was National Review or First Things, or other venues like that. Got a study. I published a study on women and gender and marriage that got a nice op-ed in the New York Times, and just began to try to figure out ways that I could bring my voice to a broader public.
But you're also working with progressives as well over these times, aren't you? In some respects, kind of establishing some kind of common ground.
Sure, more centrist, centrist with a sort of a left-leaning, so Bill Galston would be the kind of person that was involved and is involved in this kind of ongoing conversation about marriage and family, and certainly have over the years tried to sort of stress that in thinking about the challenges facing contemporary family life, that many of the cultural and legal challenges that we face would kind of make one move in a more conservative direction, but some of the economic questions that we're facing might push one in a more progressive direction. So, and I think thoughtful progressives understand, that that's the case. So people like Bill Galston and Bell Sahel at the Brookings Institution were, open to that, to that kind of perspective.
Have you collaborated with Sarah McClanahan and Andrew Cherlin in some respects? Or?
Yes, Andrew Cherlin would be another example of someone who I think, we would maybe sort of put our thumbs on different things a bit, but he's cognizant of the fact that, the challenges facing American families are not just economic, as some progressives would argue, but they're also cultural and civic and political as well, So there are a number of, I think, thoughtful and reasonably minded progressives who realize that we're facing some real challenges, particularly in working class and poor communities, around marriage and family life. And we would have both then in the mid-2000s and up to this moment in 2015 a fair bit of consensus about how to best approach these challenges, if we could just kind of wave a magic wand, which of course we can't, but if we could, so.
Yeah. How would you say general attitudes, or even maybe something like a consensus, how ideas about that have changed from when you began working in this field down till today? Have you seen much change, or is it pretty much continuity that you see? Or?
Yeah, I think that there was a growing consensus the best place for kids was the intact bio married family up through the early 2000s. I think the debate that we've had over gay marriage made that consensus fall apart to an extent. I think it's kind of reformed in many ways, though, as the gay marriage issue has receded. And by that I mean, I think there are plenty of reasonably minded scholars, including, Ron Haskins at Brookings, Bell Sahel at Brookings, Sarah McClanahan, my mentor at Princeton, and others who would argue that, it's best for kids to be raised in an intact, two-parent married family. And even the last, I would say, 6 months, there's been a lot of debates about the retreat from marriage. Is it driven primarily by cultural and legal changes, or is it driven primarily by economic changes? And the left would argue for the latter, and the right would argue for the former. But I think, among most fair-minded scholars and, policymakers and journalists, it's not that, controversial to argue that kids are going to do better when they have two married parents in the picture. The question is, well, what do we do, given the fact that most kids will not spend, the duration of their childhoods in an intact married family? So that's where I think that right now the debate's moving, and that's not that's actually a pretty good thing, that we can debate more, how do we deal with this, rather than is it a problem?
You mentioned, if you could wave a magic wand, and you kind of smiled when you said that, indicating that you have doubts about whether such a wand exists and whether you're likely to accomplish it.
Yeah.
What do you think are the obstacles to really doing even some of the basic things that there might be some kind of agreement or consensus on among the scholars?
Well, I think the challenge here is that I think most people, including, most people would acknowledge that ideally we have a lot of marriage penalties embedded in our policies targeting lower income Americans, things like Medicaid, for instance. Because they are means tested, when you bring a second adult into the household and the income goes up, a lot of families no longer qualify for support from the federal government. And so there's a kind of a disincentive to get married, and then sort of an incentive to cohabit instead. Of course, cohabitation is not as stable as marriage. So the problem, though, is fixing these disincentives takes some major legislative work. It's also expensive, potentially in at least the short term. I think you might recoup some of that if it led to some more stable marriages. That's, of course, the hope. So fixing the marriage disincentives in our public policies, targeting low-income couples, would be a good thing to do, I think. Doing a lot more at the sort of local, state, and federal level, but really, frankly, at the local level, to improve vocational education for our young adults, particularly our guys. Still, even today, only 35%, maybe a little bit more than that, of Americans actually get a college degree, and yet our whole educational system is really geared towards preparing our kids for a college career. So there's a real disconnect there, and that's important on the marriage issue, because when guys are not stably employed, and also when they don't have a good sense of their own professional abilities, they are not marriageable material. So
if the vocational education opportunities were there, do you think that low-income men would take those, or is the problem that their background makes them less likely even to be interested in pursuing that, even if it were available?
Well, that's true for some, but I mean, I think what we've seen, like there have been evaluations of a thing called career academies, and they're targeting oftentimes, young adults, young men, oftentimes from lower income, from Black and Latino communities, and they've achieved real successes in boosting their income, their employment, and their marriageability. These guys get married more than other guys from their background. So I think it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So part of it's getting rid of the marriage disincentives embedded in our policies. Part of it's trying to do a better job of educating our young adults to work in this contemporary economy, and recognizing that not everyone's going to go to college, nor should they go to college. Okay. A third thing is, I think, is recognizing that the state could do more to kind of foster kind of family wage. And one vehicle for doing that today is through a child tax credit that'd be more generous, where it would allow parents, and it would be applied both to income taxes, but which often don't hit lower income couples now, or families today, but also would apply to payroll taxes, which would hit a lot more lower income families. And that would help, I think, in effect, increase the family wage for younger and lower income couples. At least one adult workforce, that's a key caveat. And then finally, I think, and this is where and I think on those three things, addressing the marriage penalty, doing a much better job with vocational education and apprenticeship training, boosting the child tax credit, we could probably find, some consensus around those measures. But I think fundamentally what we're facing is a cultural and civic challenge, and that is that I don't think we can kind of change the dial much on marriage and family until we recognize and appreciate it, that kids are more likely to flourish after being born, or being born in a married context, and to have their parents, not only get married but stay married. So that's going to require a lot of sort of cultural work to shift the norms, particularly in working class and poor communities, and more than that, just to kind of give people some scripts about how to navigate relationships today, because they're often not sure. They've had a divorce in their background. Their friends are cheating on their boyfriend or their girlfriend. They aspire to marriage, but they don't see a path to marriage. And that's going to require both cultural changes as well as new, I think, civic initiatives to kind of give people real models and real support in moving into marriage and staying married. So, and I think even on that, a lot of what I said, I think a lot of people on both the right and in the center and part of the left could understand and appreciate that. But achieving those kinds of cultural and civic objectives in this climate, which is more both progressive and libertarian, is going to be challenging.
There are different levels of culture. Think about intellectuals, then you also think of popular culture.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how much they would move together or how much they're independent. Just think of Hollywood, for example, right. And the portrayal of right. sex and love and commitment in most movies and TV and so forth.
Right. I think that there's a kind of, they're not totally disconnected. I think, there are plenty of people in Hollywood who read, the New York Times and the New Yorker, and, so kind of the academic world has kind of an indirect impact on the media world in terms of, these kinds of, thoughtful opinion or news, organs. And then those things in turn have some kind of impact on the, on the kind of pop culture that's produced in Hollywood. So there's sort of these loose connections, but they're not tightly connected by any means. And I think, all the folks in Hollywood are, I'm just, I'm guessing they're trying to make money, but they also, they want to provoke oftentimes and push the envelope in ways, that they think will be both engaging and remunerative. But the collective effect of a lot of the stuff that they produce is to kind of corrode a culture where, sacrifice, restraint, commitment can emerge. And these are things, of course, that we need for strong marriages and strong families.
Yeah. One of the books you're familiar with is, or a scholar you're familiar with, is Stephanie Kuntz. And
yes.
One of the constant refrains of her work is, there's no going back. It's, we're not going to go back there.
Sure.
All these changes are here to stay. How much is it possible to go back? And in what respect? Obviously some things are completely irreversible.
Right.
But are there some ways where you think it is possible to somehow make changes and not necessarily go back to some supposed golden age of the past, which never existed, but at least to find some elements which might restore a little bit more stability to family life in this country?
Yeah, it's, this is sort of the assumption of the progressive intellectual, right, that we're always kind of progressing, moving forward in a certain way. And so sort of, the subtitle for MSNBC. Yeah, we're not going back to 1950 or 1850 or 1050.
And in some ways, we don't want to go.
Exactly.
We don't want to go back to 1950.
I think it's important for us to acknowledge too, that there are some positive things about 2015. If you look at least an intact family, what you see is that, dads are much more engaged practically with their kids than they were in 1950, So I don't want to, people talk about Ozzie and Harriet, for instance. I've never even seen the frickin' show. And
did Ozzie actually work? People have asked for decades.
I mean, you're always, as a conservative, you're always clubbed with, you want to go back to Ozzie and Harriet. I'm like, I've never even seen the darn show. I was raised by a single mother. It's like, all this means nothing to me. So I think, I don't want to go back to 1950, and I don't think anyone.
Of course, the place of women in society is somewhat, one of the really fundamental issues there.
Correct. But I think that's an important issue. But I think, in terms of going forward, I think, going forward on these questions is, can we go in a direction that's, better for men, better for women, and better for kids is really the question we should ask ourselves. And I think what Stephanie Kuntz's work doesn't always acknowledge or recognize is that even today, when you look at ordinary women, not women in the academy, but ordinary women, it's still the case that the majority of American moms do not want to work full time. Okay, so things have changed a lot, and they're going to continue to change. But there's something about motherhood and the tie between a woman and her child that's, for many women, really extraordinary, and engenders a sense of, of privilege and a desire to be really close and connected to her kids in ways that, at least when her kids are young, can be difficult if she's working full time. So, might we move to a system where it's more like the Netherlands, where there are lots of parents, particularly women, who are working part-time when they have small kids, and that's, I think, a possibility, and one which would be a mark of progress, I would say, but not a turn back to the 1950s. But I think also, too, recognizing that, in this new economy, the kind of industrial model where, or a big business model where dad went to work from, 8:30 to 5, and mom was at home, that's all, of course, gone to pieces. And I think one other thing there's a lot of things that are not good about today, but one of the things that is good about today is that I think both moms and dads can work from home more, and can kind of in some ways revive a kind of domestic economy, a home economy where there's not the same distance between work and family that there was in 1950 or 55. So yes, Stephanie Kuntz is right to say that things have changed. We're not going to turn the clock back, and we're not going to go back to the 50s gender model or gender role model. But I think we can try to figure out, are there ways that we can recognize and appreciate the differences that exist between women and men. And one of which is just that women tend to have a stronger tie to their kids when they're infants and toddlers. Work with that, but at the same time, I think also integrate men more, continue to integrate men more, successfully into the picture, both by working at home, by being flexible in the workday, allowing them to kind of connect with their kids if they're in school, at school. Because, and this is a point of progress, we know that both for women and for men, the experience of being a parent is a generative experience. And so it's actually a good thing that guys oftentimes are able to be more meaningfully engaged in the lives of their kids, not just in the evenings and on weekends, but, through in the course of a day when, they take some time off work to go see a child's, play or performance or athletic activity.
So what does the future hold, do you think? Do you have any kinds of ideas about where your scholarship will go in the future? What kinds of things you want to do?
In the last 2 years, I've been working with the Institute for Family Studies and the American Enterprise Institute on a project called the Home Economics Project, and trying to understand how what happens in the family doesn't just stay in the family. It spills over, if you will, into the economic arena, into the marketplace. And this project is designed to help us to understand basically how, at least on average, strong families tend to generate better economic outcomes. So we did a report last year called For Richer, for Poorer, and that is Robert Lerman at the Urban Institute and I did. And this report basically shows that this retreat from marriage in America has been a primary driver of economic inequality, of stagnating wages for families or stagnating incomes for families, and of the retreat from men in the workplace. Because when men don't get married, don't stay married, they're much less likely to work full time. So this project will turn next to looking at the link between strong families and economic growth, both in the United States and around the world. And then probably to think about ways in which there's a connection between the strength of the family and the strength of the state. That is, as the family weakens, the state has to sort of step in to kind of pick up the pieces. So that's a new project, but I think beyond that, I'd like to think a lot more about this sort of pattern we see in our life, common life today, and that is that at least right now we have a pattern. This is something that Charles Murray has also pointed out, that elites tend to talk left and walk right when it comes to family life, among other things. And I'd like to kind of look at that issue, document that issue, and then, but also try to sort of, in doing so, to articulate a clear idea of what works in 2015 for families, and work with institutions, civic institutions, to try to get the sort of what works when it comes to dating, mating, having a family, and get that, some of the latest science on those questions out to a broader public audience. Because, there's a lot of new research that I think is very helpful in informing how we handle questions of dating and mating and family life that, we're not doing a good job on oftentimes today, but there's a lot of research out there that could inform our common life in those topics.
Well, we look forward to hearing about some of that later today,
we'll hear
and
about that tonight.
it's wonderful to have you here.
Thanks,
We're very
Chris. Good to be
grateful,
here.
and look forward to all that work you'll be doing in the future.
Great.
Again, this is Chris Wolfe in the American Public Philosophy, and I've been interviewing Brad Wilcox here, Director of the National Marriage Project and Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia, especially about his research on marriage, family, cohabitation, etc. So we look forward to seeing you on some other occasions. We look forward to posting this on our website, www.appii.org, and perhaps to seeing you at future events. So long.